Hang on. You should be. Wait a minute. Okay, how's that? Can you hear me? Okay, I can't hear you. You're still on mute.
I'm on mute. It'd help if I turned my mute off.
Well, you know, I was on mute, and then you were on mute, and the whole thing was very 2020. It was very peak 2020.
Yep. How's everything going?
You know.
You looking at it?
Yeah. How's Wallace?
He's great. He's great. He slept through the night for the first time last night without the middle of the night feeding. You know, there's usually a 3 a.m. feeding, so that's progress right there.
Yes, definitely.
Now, you look like you're sitting here in an FSU classroom.
Yeah, I set it up that way.
Good.
It's fake. I'm sitting in a rocking chair, but whatever.
Oh, cool.
Okay, I'm thinking about what we're gonna do. It should be pretty not a big deal. I imagine what I'll do is just say hi, thank you everybody for coming. Dr. Cable's gonna talk now, and then I'm gonna invite folks to why hello.
How are you guys?
Dr. Wood is here to save me in case my internet goes weird.
Oh, hey, Dr. Wood. You're so tall up there. I didn't recognize you.
Yeah, that's okay. I was
since-
trying to have cool Christmas decorations behind me, but
No.
I realized the kids had to go somewhere, so they get the sparkles.
There you go.
How are they adjusting to the new situation?
It's good. I mean, well, yeah, John, I hear this is your situation too. With a newborn in the house, you don't sleep. So
yeah, that's right.
But,
yes, that's accurate.
But to be fair, I'm sleeping more than when I was pregnant. So
oh, good.
It's a win.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, and my mother-in-law's here, and she's awesome. So we're like, it's fine.
Okay. Do they live around, or they just kind of stay in?
No, she flew in. So this is an election baby. This is a kid. I went in, So she got in on election day from Knoxville.
Oh my Lord.
And then I went in for my 39-week appointment the next morning, and they're like, you should walk 2 blocks to the hospital and have this baby like right now. So
well, good.
But then the election happened.
By the way, that's wonderful.
5 blocks away.
Number 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So yeah, no, and the best part was we got evicted from the hospital, or they let us out. Did I tell you this, Catherine?
No.
Within, I think, an hour or 2 of the election being called.
Oh, holy shit.
And I'm at the hospital that's 5 blocks from the convention center where all the Pennsylvania votes were counted.
Mm-hmm.
So the city burst into spontaneous parades. So I had ordered takeout from a restaurant in the middle of everything. And I ended up with my hospital bands on walking to get it because it was faster for a lady post C-section to walk to get the food, because the celebration was breaking out everywhere. But it was kind of cool because I was standing outside on the sidewalk and everybody's cheering. There's helicopters flying around, but it was
good.
But how are things with you, John? I heard you had an exciting
situation.
Yeah. It was a long time, long big ordeal, but everything turned out great. We spent a lot more time in Albany, Georgia than we ever thought we would. But good people at the neonatal ICU. Those folks are great. If we said if we ever win the lottery, we're just going to give it all to the neonatal workers.
Yeah. No, that's so. How long were you guys in the NICU?
5 weeks for him.
That's long. Yeah. No, that's tough.
Yeah. But he's doing better now, so that's good.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. And you're out, so even better. Congrats.
Yeah.
No, that's
ready to take on the world.
Super great.
Yeah. I think this is pretty standard. The only thing that might be weird and different than a regular talk is the questions. So what I was going to do was just tell people to put the questions in the chat to me,
Okay.
And then I will, and they can chat them to you too, obviously, but I don't want you to have to be worried about looking at the chat. So I'm going to tell them they can direct the questions to me, and then I will read them to you.
Okay.
And I mean, they're going to be like 10 people, I think. So it's not going to be like, I don't know who's talking.
It's a friendly audience.
Yeah,
Good.
it's very, yes, it's all basically people who know you, I think,
Yeah.
you know, and who
All right,
are, you know,
cool.
eager to come be supportive. So I think
Well,
it'll
it'll be good to see everybody again. It's been a little while.
be nice.
Since the crazy week in March that I've seen most folks.
Yeah, I think it's all going to be good. There's been a lot of, and I was also pleased to see that when we put it on the university calendar, there are all kinds of people I'd never heard of who were like, oh, I want to come.
Oh,
And
nice.
Good.
That's nice. Like
Yay.
people who actually like just work at FSU, who just, you know, who just thought, oh, that seems important and interesting.
I got it some time on Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah. Why not?
Right.
I'm working at
Rock on a
university.
Wednesday. I'm glad if anybody comes out at this time on this day.
I know, seriously. I mean, I was having to, I had this conversation.
Thank you all for working with my public school schedule and everything. Like this
Oh,
is
yeah.
Of course.
after hall duty. This is about the only time there is.
This is when yeah, right. Look, you have a job, my friend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have a
You're
job. That's
you're a
true.
poster
I mean, that's
child.
huge. So, yeah.
Poster child.
And you
Yeah.
got maps behind you. I mean, you have gravitas.
Oh, I know.
Damn right.
Maps, all kinds of maps.
I love it.
All right, I'm gonna start.
You'll let everybody in.
Yeah, I'm gonna start letting people in. Imagine they'll kind of trickle in. I'm gonna give it, I don't know, I might give them like 3 minutes or something.
That's
So
fair.
let it like go through. Oh boy. Oh boy.
We said about 45 and 45, right?
Yeah, I think so. Jan, you're here. Yay. All right. Well, thank everybody for coming. I know this is a very busy time.
I miss getting coffee with so many of you right now. Like, can we?
Again, Paul, I just have to say, I find your Zoom background incredibly distracting because I've seen far too many films where the mystery is woven into the tapestry that's behind the person. And, you know, it's just, you know, for all of our books that everyone else has behind us, yours seems like it's encoding more pertinent information. And it just throws me off.
To me, yeah. You're the first one to notice, but there are many messages and meanings embedded therein.
This could go a
so-
Da Vinci Code direction, you know, like if you wanted it to, we could go the like pop culture historian movie route.
Exactly.
I'd be okay with that.
Yeah.
National treasure.
Yeah, Blake actually got this in Georgia, in the Republic of Georgia, not in the state of Georgia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Traveling 15,000 miles is more impressive than 50. So yes, thanks for having
Yes.
clarification.
Yes. And traveling anywhere nowadays is very impressive. But no, he didn't do it. He did this long ago.
Okay.
In the pre-COVID time.
Yeah.
One of my friends calls it pre-COVIDian. It's the pre-COVIDian time. Yeah.
Yes. But to answer your email, Chuck, I'm glad everything is good up there. Are the boys back in New York?
We are doing a pickup round after I'm hosting an online conference this weekend, and then we are picking up Jake at Haverford and on Sunday, and then on Monday, Tuesday we're heading up to Cornell to get Aaron. So
Nice.
Both boys got to stay the full semester, such as it is, and we're both really glad they got to campus. So good times.
Yeah, well, Haverford's done a really good job of their like weekly testing. I've been impressed.
Well, I think Cornell, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Haverford's been on strike for 2 weeks, so
That's true. I forgot about that. Yeah. I Skyped into somebody's or Zoomed into somebody's class like the week before that happened. So
okay.
I know what the dorms look like there now. Got real familiar.
Yeah, they seem to have pulled things together, but it weathered the strike. But it was kind of a little disconcerting because Jake tells us nothing. We talk with him once a week, but only on the condition we do not ask him anything about him or Haverford.
Yeah.
So we can talk about politics. We talk about us. Anyway, but hey, at least he's talking to us, so that's good, right? By the way, but anyway, we're just killing time. I hope we're not stealing too much of your thunder here, John. Should we like steer the chit chat towards things that'll be relevant to your talk?
Oh no, yeah, no, it's all good. I'm just kind of fumbling papers around here. I'll probably not realize I'm on mute several times here, so if that ever happens, just wave your hands at me.
Well,
my kids, we're teaching, in a hybrid way here right now. So there's a Chromebook open on a desk that watches me, and that's all the kids at home, and then there are the kids that are in front of me here. And probably once a day, I get somebody in the class in the classroom here gets a text on their phone from somebody sitting at home saying that it's on mute and we can't see his face and it's angled away from the board or something. And I'm like, God, it's crazy. Yeah, so that'll happen. I'm sorry. Apologies in advance for my bad tech skills here.
No worries.
Well, I think
since you do have multiple laptops there, you can get some really interesting effects if you log into the same meeting on 3 different computers with 3 different camera angles.
I don't know that I would know how to do that.
It can be wildly disconcerting in a fun sort of a way. Fun, maybe, I don't know. Well,
yeah, that would just boggle the mind.
Yes.
Okay, well, I think we gave people a few minutes, and I'm sure a few more people will trickle in, but it's a good population to start. So,
because I could keep this random banner up going.
I got it. I would like to welcome everyone to Dr. John Cable's talk about his research, which was funded by a Martin Veggie Fellowship, which I know he is very grateful for because it was invaluable to completing his dissertation, which, as his title suggests, is about Mississippi in the post-World War II period, seen through a lens of transnational settler colonialism and the sort of, I would say, the precursor to massive resistance, perhaps, which we might call frantic resistance. And he's going to talk more about that for about 45 minutes, and then we will take questions. If you would direct your questions to me in the chat, that way he won't have to worry about sort of doing 2 things at once. And then I can go ahead and read them aloud to him, and everyone will have the benefit of being able to hear the question. And if I screw up your question, please do chat me and say, hey, that's not what I meant. And, can we clarify? And we will have plenty of time for that. So I will go ahead and turn this over to John Cable.
Hey, all right. So I'm going to try and share the screen here. And that's something I've never done before. So here goes nothing. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. Okay. Host, is that you, Dr. Mooney?
Yeah, I think I just fixed it for you, so try it again.
All right, let's see. Okay, I think that's it. All right, are you seeing my screen right now? Great, wonderful. You're not seeing yourself on my screen, are you? Okay, everything's good then. So first of all, thanks to all of you for taking the time to come out on a Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And second of all, thank you to all the people that made this fellowship possible, the Martin Veggie folks and the committee as well. As Dr. Mooney mentioned, there's no chance I could have gotten this dissertation done pre-COVID without that fellowship. It came in, for those of you that don't know, it came in the fall of 2019, so last fall. And I'll talk more about the archives I was able to visit and whatnot later on, but I was basically able to get the bulk of the writing done and a few more trips done and get most of everything wrapped up before January of 2020. And like I say, without that, I never would have finished, and I would have been still not finished now. So thank you to everybody that helped make that possible. This was, you know, kind of a godsend. So, also, as Dr. Mooney mentioned, my project is called Frantic Resistance, Settler Colonialism, Enclosure, and the Postwar Transformation of Mississippi, 1945 to 1960, and that is the book project title as well. So first I'll give kind of an overview of the project and basically the talk. I'll talk a little bit about the archives, where I was able to go on this fellowship, talk a little bit about the records, and then finally what the future plans are and what the timeline looks like. So in the late 1940s and 1950s, the colonial system finally began to collapse. Its bedrock principles lost legitimacy and its costs became far too great, especially amid rising anti-colonial movements. For much of the colonized world, the post-war years were a period of great optimism, and rightfully so, but there were some important outliers. Digging in against the, I guess, generally liberalizing trend were white settler states like Kenya, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and I argue in this project, Mississippi. Settlers viewed decolonization as an existential threat, and they resisted it pretty violently. Shoring up their resistance, again, I argue in this book project, was the transition from labor-intensive to capital-intensive agriculture, which almost invariably favored large white landowners. Shifts in farming is basically the argument here is that shifts in farming produced social disruptions that set limits on decolonial change. I should probably say something about the intervention I hope to make with this project as well. So except in a growing body of work on transnational networks of activism, the American South has pretty much remained curiously absent from scholarship on global decolonization and vice versa. The many reasons for that are not the subject of this project necessarily. I do, however, want to suggest that recent work on the limited reach of the American Civil Rights Movement, specifically the work of Pete Daniel, Greta de Jong, and Carlin Forner, might call for a more expansive framework. These and other scholars point to ways in which a restructuring agricultural economy pulled the economic rug essentially out from under Black Southerners in the middle of a political revolution. And I think that telling that story as a part of a broader narrative of global decolonization poses the land question in a more, I guess, cosmopolitan global perspective, raising themes of indigeneity and settler colonialism that remain underexplored in the literature on the post-war South. So, some context. Before World War II, settler agriculture was highly labor intensive. While the specifics of land tenure varied over time and space, as you can imagine, non-white farmers generally kind of fought an uphill battle. In Neshoba County in East Central Mississippi, where this study is centered, landowners used Black, Choctaw, and poor white tenants to grow mainly cotton and corn on purloined Choctaw land. Likewise, in the White Highlands of Kenya, land poor Kikuyu and some Maasai farmers became squatters on settler farms. In Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, labor coercion that basically resembled the neo-slavery of the American South forced uprooted Shona and Ndebele peasants into the mines and increasingly onto settler farms. And in South Africa, sharecroppers, while they might sometimes enjoy a degree of autonomy, led an increasingly precarious existence at the mercy of white landlords. Settlers everywhere relied on non-white farmers for their labor, but looked for ways to be less dependent. But then things started to change after 1945, as the politics and economics, rather, of settler colonialism faced kind of a reckoning. First, white supremacy came under unprecedented attack, and this happened for several reasons. World War II had made the colonial system difficult to sustain in economic or ideological terms. The war had hobbled the major imperial powers, and Nazi atrocities had given racism a bad name. In the US, as this clipping indicates here, peonage and lynching became less prominent as the FBI pursued those things a little bit more closely. Perhaps the most decisive factor were the post-war movements for equal rights and self-determination that rendered a continuation of the status quo pretty much impossible. But as you can imagine, settlers were defiant and sort of doubled down in the face of international opprobrium. In Africa, as historian Carolyn Elkins and David Anderson and others have shown, they had no intention of giving up their home fronts regardless of the cost. And such was also the case in Mississippi. Neshoba County resident Florence Mars observed that her fellow white Mississippians had, quote, fully lost contact with reality in those years, citing, quote, frantic resistance to the granting of constitutional rights to non-white people. At the very same time, settlers gained access to machinery and chemicals that reduced and in some cases eliminated their dependence on hand labor. In Mississippi, a segregated extension service moved to prop up large white landowners who could take advantage of economies of scale and displaced the rest. Extension economist H.J. Putnam's 1946 test demonstration report is particularly revealing. And I'll quote him here, quote, the disappearance of farm families from Mississippi farms during the past 5 years, 1941 to 1946, should not be looked upon with regret, but with extreme satisfaction, end quote. Big farmers, quote, should be able to earn more as some of their labor is lost to industry or dislocated because of the introduction of labor-saving equipment. In Neshoba County, extension agents reported that, quote, stress has been placed on using as much farm machinery as available so as to save labor. They worked hard to sell local farmers on the new methods, and their efforts bore fruit in pretty short order. For instance, Norval Johnson, a white landowner, explained in 1946 that, quote, there are two principal ways to operate a farm, with tenants, mules, and a sharecrop system, or by machinery, and I prefer the machinery method. The return of cotton acreage allotments and marketing quotas in 1950 found county agents encouraging farmers to make every acre count, which for hill country farmers, which is basically where Neshoba County is in Mississippi in the kind of red clay hills of the east central portion, this increasingly meant getting out of cotton altogether. Agent C.S. Norton, who you can see here on the right, the county agent in Neshoba County, wrote the same sentence at the end of every annual crop report for the rest of the 1950s, and that was this, quote, with decreased emphasis on cotton and with cotton acreage allotments during the year, interest is shifting from row crops to livestock production. Between 1950 and 1959, the number of Neshoba County farms that derived more than 50% of their income from cotton declined from almost 1,500 to 490. Many who abandoned these row crops for livestock also took advantage of a new trend in the area in what they called tree farming. In the late 1940s, local lumber companies, how this would go is local lumber companies began offering private landowners forest management services in return for right of first refusal on their timber, for which companies promised competitive prices. And with the enthusiastic support of the Extension Service, tree farming took off in the region. Of course, and this is kind of an important point to note in all of this, the transition to dairy and tree farming and other forms of farming other than row cropping rendered superfluous the labor that had been necessary when cotton was still king. And so Here, I should probably stress a certain point that I'm asked often, when I explain the argument of this book project or just talk about what I'm trying to say here. And that's the question of, was displacement of agricultural labor necessarily political at all? Were people tractored off the land, or were they lured from the land by better jobs in better places? And I think we've pretty much settled the fact that they were in fact tractored off the land, but was it political? I think we have to understand that, as Ira Katznelson and others have shown, by World War II, Southern legislators had generally become at least highly skeptical of, if not outright hostile to, New Deal or any other federal government intervention in Southern society. And they increasingly saw any and all outside programs or ideas as potential threats to white supremacy. So for anything very new to be accepted by these Southern gatekeepers, it had to pass the smell test of white supremacy. And the fact that a massive overhaul of Southern agriculture and rural life was allowed to uproot most of the arrangement on which Southern society had been built necessarily means, in my mind, that white supremacists in high places saw basically no threat in it. In fact, they embraced it lock, stock, and barrel. So again, I think, when you talk about what was mechanization, was chemicalization, was this agrarian transition necessarily political, I think anybody there in Mississippi in the 40s, 50s, and 60s could have seen that absolutely it is, given the composition of the Extension Service, the behavior of the Extension Service, the various other USDA agencies in the state, and just how skeptical Southerners were of any outside ideas that did threaten white supremacy. I think this was pretty clear in the sources, and it's pretty clear in much of the literature on the subject. I also think it's worth noting that such shifts had close parallels in settler states of Southern and Eastern Africa. White farmers there also enjoyed generous state assistance, for one, and during and after World War II, they parlayed their advantage into capital intensive rather than labor intensive operations that rid them much of the African labor that they depended on beforehand. Credits and tax breaks subsidized their mechanization. Tractor purchases soared, while work oxen died and were generally not replaced. African farmers, from smallholders to tenants, faced displacement. Much of the change coincided with developmentalist rhetoric, which was outwardly concerned with soil conservation and informed by American agricultural experts, that painted Africans as basically careless farmers. And as in the United States, displacement forced many of them onto even smaller, more crowded plots, and then something that's pretty specific to Africa, worn out reserve lands or into urban areas. So anyway, we're sort of reaching out and making those transnational connections because the situations were pretty similar. So across the settler world, the transition to capital-intensive agriculture made it harder for non-white people to press for decolonial change. Mississippi Choctaws had long sought to recover lands owed to them under the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek of 1830 that settlers had in many cases just taken outright. Landlessness had since rendered most Choctaws sharecroppers on settler farms. So after the tribe reconstituted itself in 1945 under the Indian Reorganization Act, its greatest priority was understandably the pursuit of land claims. Tribal council member Jim Gardner declared in 1945, just as the tribe was reorganized, quote, "Land is the biggest problem." But even as the tribal council pursued a cash settlement through the new Indian Claims Commission, which was basically settling all outstanding Indian claims before the BIA enacted its termination program in the 50s, changes in farming were in Mississippi displacing Choctaw sharecroppers and thinning the tribe's ranks in the state. Many were then forced to leave the reservation and pick cotton in the Delta, pick fruits and vegetables in Florida, or even sharecrop in Western Tennessee, where the demand for hand labor wasn't quite yet as depressed. Others took advantage of the Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation program, which hand in hand with the termination program, had the goal of mainstreaming and assimilating Indians by moving entire families off of the reservation to urban centers like Chicago, LA, Minneapolis, and other places. Of course, Choctaws who left the state faced the unhappy prospect of having children who would then be denied Choctaw citizenship, which was conferred only on children born in Mississippi. This was bad for Choctaws, but again, right in line with the federal government's termination policy. And let's see. Though they would ultimately pursue change through a rights-based framework that emphasized desegregation and the franchise, Black residents of East Central Mississippi were not unconcerned with the land question either, and some even drew parallels to settler states in Africa. Hailing from a farm 10 miles south of Neshoba County, these two fellows right here, Medgar and Charles Evers, were close observers of events in the White Highlands of Kenya, aspects of which were quite similar to what was happening in Mississippi in the 1950s. In response to wartime demand and the flow of capital from Britain, settler farmers in the highlands had mechanized and intensified their farming operations and had begun expelling many of their Kikuyu and Maasai squatters. And given how profitable settlers had finally become after the war, the Labor government now depended on them to help Britain rebuild its economy. At the very same time, authorities eased restrictions on independent African farmers who had long been prohibited from growing certain cash crops like coffee. The growth in peasant production, among other factors, meant that the lands to which the expelled Kikuyu squatters hoped to return were now no longer available to them. So basically, there's now a bottleneck. Urban alternatives are not forthcoming as industry really can't absorb all the excess unemployed people coming from farms. And soon a movement called Mau Mau ends up taking desperate measures to try and achieve their goals of land and freedom. The Evers brothers followed the Mau Mau uprising in the US press, and they became especially taken with the imprisoned Kikuyu activist Jomo Kenyatta. And I'm quoting Charles Evers here, "We learned all we could about Kenyatta in the papers, from friends, reports on the shortwave radio. The Evers brothers respected him for having traveled widely, for having studied at the London School of Economics, and then having returned to his native Kenya to fight for his people's right to the land, despite the obvious risks that that entailed in the 1930s and 40s. The brothers felt similarly about their own home. Indeed, they too had traveled widely as soldiers, only to return to Mississippi, as Medgar Evers recalled, quote, to make a positive contribution. As they read more about developments in Kenya, the brothers became emboldened. And I'm quoting Charles Evers again here, why not really cross the line? Why not create a Mau Mau in Mississippi? Many Mississippians, after all, faced enclosure and displacement, which were the very issues at the heart of the Mau Mau rebellion. But ultimately, they never followed through on the idea. According to Charles Evers, quote, we bought bullets, we made some idle Mau Mau plans, but Medgar never had his heart in it. And over time, we just dropped it. Just as a side note, Medgar and his wife, Merle Evers, did, however, name their first child, Daryl Kenyatta Evers. In any case, their eschewal of a Mau Mau approach in favor of voter registration work for the NAACP did little to assuage white paranoia in Mississippi. And this is one of the points I find so fascinating, but I guess it should come as no surprise that Mississippi whites made much of Medgar Evers' fascination with Mau Mau in that turbulent decade of the 50s. The Jackson Clarion Ledger referred to him as, quote, Medgar Evers, the Mau Mau admirer. And not for the first time, Mississippi columnist Tom Etheridge drew comparisons between Mississippi and settler states in Africa. He alleged that, quote, outsiders were fanning, quote, flames of unrest in Kenya and South Africa, and that those same, quote, meddlers were, quote, spiritual comrades of NAACP's zealots and kindred fanatics here in the United States. Their tactics are entirely similar, end quote. Furthermore, quote, like Dixie, South Africa realizes that racial integration is certain to bring chaos, which must eventually lead to Black control of government. So, far from representing a lunatic fringe in Mississippi, Etheridge's column, Mississippi Notebook, spoke to what was then actually the mainstream of Mississippi, white Mississippi opinion. Well-capitalized white landowners who shared similar fears and predilections were important shot callers in their local communities. They were ASC committeemen, Farm Bureau officers, Citizens Council members, Citizens Council officers, Sunday school teachers. In the 1950s, county agents introduced many of these same farmers and landowners to TV personality Howard Langfitt, pictured on the right here, who hosted a television program on Jackson's WLBT TV called Farm Family of the Week. This show featured what Langfitt called, quote, completely mechanized farmers, those who had gotten rid of their tenants and embraced, quote, modern farming. Farm Family of the Week profiles, in retrospect, kind of afford a glimpse at the sorts of farmers that who could actually survive at a time when, gosh, Agricultural Secretary Ezra Taft Benson said that the mantra was basically get big or get out. These were large landowners whom county agents hoped would edge everybody else out, which was an objective that in the 1950s in Mississippi was, I think, ineluctably political. In 1956, for instance, Howard Langfitt featured on his television show Mr. and Mrs. Bud Fulcher from just north of Neshoba. He praised Fulcher's, quote, modern dairy barn, which will hold 10 cows and is completely modern in every way, end of quote. While they still grew some cotton, they, quote, did not crop anything on the shares, which means they had evicted their sharecroppers. Fulcher was president of the County Farm Bureau and a member of the White Citizens Council. Another of Langfitt's guests, Leonard Duncan, had converted the Neshoba County row cropping operation he had to livestock and tree farming, and according to Langfitt was a, quote, completely mechanized farmer with, quote, 2 tractors, baler, combine, and the equipment he needs to operate his farm program. Duncan was also director of the local Farm Bureau and had served on both the community and county ASC committees, which was a committee that was from the 1940s all the way until the late 1960s, if not later, completely white, and it was in charge of doling out acreage allotments to farmers and deciding who could grow how much of what. As the ranks of farmers in Mississippi and elsewhere grew fewer, richer, and whiter, the imperviousness of settler society to decolonial change became pretty clear. In 1960, Ezekiel C. Smith of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights reported that white landowners in Mississippi had, quote, effectively bottled up the state's non-white residents. And I'm quoting Smith here, economically, the colored people are almost entirely dependent upon the white people. And he added that, quote, in the farming areas, the situation looks hopeless, end quote. The Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians learned the same year that the government had tossed out their land claim years earlier, though their attorney, a local white man, had not even bothered to tell them. They now faced an uncertain future as sharecroppers at a time when their labor was obviously becoming redundant. Elsewhere in Kenya, 1960, the very same year, witnessed the beginning of British divestment and a, quote, willing buyer, willing seller arrangement for transferring land in the highlands, although quite predictably this arrangement coddled the settlers and did little to help landless Kikuyu. In South Africa, tenant evictions escalated after the 1950s and reached all-time highs in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there, as in Southern Rhodesia, inequitable land distribution continued to be a source of great conflict. While the Union Jack was finally lowered in Kenya in 1960, settlers in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa did not concede majority rule until 1980 and 1994, respectively. And as you might imagine, and as you probably know, land remains an extraordinarily hot issue in both of those places. Like the other settler states, Mississippi continued to struggle over issues of land and economic justice, even after 1960. And even after the 1964 martyrdom of 3 activists in Neshoba County helped force the passage of landmark civil rights legislation, Substantive change came much too slowly for most Black and Choctaw residents. The displacement of thousands of farmers prompted unemployment crises, for one, that found every county in East Central Mississippi clamoring for federal redevelopment funds and submitting one of what you see here, which is an overall economic development program packet to the redevelopment authorities in Washington, basically begging for money because of the effects of mechanization, chemicalization, and the utter just glut of ex-farmers crowding into the cities and towns. This sort of thing continued to be a problem for most of the 60s. And to quote a 1977 report from the Civil Rights Commission's Mississippi Advisory Committee, quote, although federal court rulings, federal troops, federal civil rights laws, and federal dollars have been critical factors in altering attitudes and behavior in the state, meaningful change is as difficult to see as the progress of a glacier that advances at the rate of inches each millennium. And they made sure to point out that the effects of these two kind of converging trends of agrarian transition and white resistance were, part of the reason why. So to wrap up, this book project, I hope, tells an old story in kind of a new way, by merging two, I guess, mostly discrete literatures, Southern history and settler colonial studies. I hope it suggests a more cosmopolitan and perhaps maybe a little bit more disturbing understanding of the South's place in the post-war world. In reframing modern Southern history as settler colonial history, this book focuses on how people related to the land and examines the cultural practices that those relationships engendered. It treats indigenous dispossession and capitalist exploitation as central and enduring moral catastrophes, and implicates the South, though not to the exclusion of the non-South, in the global problem of white settlerism. And finally, it places the Southern enclosure movement in the context of the broader death of the peasantry, which the world's racist regimes sought to use for their own ends, as we've shown here. Such an interpretive shift, as I'm trying to attempt here, links the post-war South to a history that's not really typically associated with it, and that is the history of the global color line. That history, as it unfolded over the 19th century and early 20th century from Australasia and Southern Africa to North America, involved subduing, displacing, or eliminating native people for their land. As Patrick Wolfe has demonstrated, unlike agents of purely extractive, military, or missionary colonialisms, settlers came in large numbers and they came to stay. By the early 20th century, white predominance was more or less complete in such places, which is a fact that's most starkly reflected in the distribution of land. For instance, in East Central Mississippi, whites owned almost all of the land by the early 20th century, Black farmers only a small amount, and Choctaws practically none. And subterfuge and violence pretty much kept it that way through World War II. But, and this is, a significant part of the study as well, if achieving a society based on stolen land and cheap or coerced labor might have conferred supreme confidence on white settlers, their patterns of behavior actually suggest otherwise. So thinking about post-war Mississippi, and I'm wrapping up now, thinking about post-war Mississippi and the South more broadly as a settler society, I think involves acknowledging the role that existential fear played in shaping white culture. Whites were not unaware of the human cost of their predominance, even if they did next to nothing to allay that cost. As perpetrators, they bore their share of the trauma of founding violence and chattel slavery uneasily, and they were ever anxious about an imminent reversal of fortune. And I'm quoting a white Southern author in 1964 who says, "We are here frightened in the depths because our past does not sweep us forward or backward. In the person of the Negro, it sweeps us where we are afraid to go." End quote. In fact, racial anxiety seems to have been a sine qua non of settler colonialism. Beneath a thin veneer of strength lay a complex of white paranoia. Such anxiety, I think we've seen, knitted the world's settler communities closer together as the post-war wind of change threatened their way of life. South African journalist John R. Parker, for instance, was far from alone in his appeal, reprinted in the Jackson Clarion Ledger, that the, quote, two conservative Souths should be welded together in a firm bond of friendship. And just as white Kenyans and Rhodesians armed themselves and learned to sleep with one eye open, so too did white Mississippians succumb to a form of racist hysteria. The 1964 murder of 3 civil rights workers in Neshoba County is only, I think, the best known example of what kind of behavior Mahmoud Mamdani suggested is, quote, more or less a rule of thumb in settler societies. Anxious settlers, I argue, found in the post-war agricultural revolution, with its displacement of disproportionately non-white people and its upward redistribution of real property, a means to shore up white supremacy when it seemed most threatened. Moreover, the ensuing changes demonstrated that territoriality remained a live issue. Well after the disappearance of a frontier of settlement enclosure reinvigorated the settler colonial propensity for conquest and exploitation. And I think that's pretty clear when you look at the transfers of massive amounts of land in Mississippi from tenants, sharecroppers, and small landowners to basically only large farmers. And similar things happen elsewhere, as we've seen. Of course, few spoke of the issue in those terms in the 1940s and 50s, but as I think I've shown, human displacement and land consolidation were hardly unintended consequences here. More often, they were the central goal, the pursuit of which naturally frustrated the advance of human rights everywhere we saw this pattern play out. And finally, as this book project argues, and as I hope I've shown a little bit of, the world in which we now live, which is one of unsteady work, persistent inequality, and political revolutions gone backward, owes at least in part to the fateful convergence of decolonization and agrarian transition. And with that, I'll talk a little bit about the archives, the sources, and then we'll be out. On Martin Vegi funds, for which I'm again very, very thankful, I was able to visit Kansas City, Missouri. NARA there was super, super helpful. Great people and tons of great records there. I was able to also jet over to Jackson, Mississippi and spend some more time in the Department of Archives and History there, as well as the Chataimi Cultural Center in Neshoba County, Choctaw, Mississippi. And the folks at the Neshoba County Library were also very kind and gracious. The records I was able to retrieve with Martin Vegi funds, without which I could not have done most of this work. The records of the Extension Service were huge. They're in almost every footnote. The WPA records from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History were also good for the early sources, pre-World War II. The Neshoba Democrat is, I had to pick the county in Mississippi that doesn't have a digitized newspaper yet. So of course that, next time I'll know to pick somewhere else. But yeah, the Neshoba Democrat's on, hand crank microfilm in the Mississippi archives. So that was of course invaluable. The folks at the tribal archives at Choctaw, Mississippi were trusting and gracious enough to allow me to sit in their archives for days on end and take notes. And finally, local and various local sources, mainly from the public library, but from other places as well. So suffice it to say, without the Martin Vegi Fellowship, this would have been totally impossible on this timeline. Speaking of which, the manuscript is due in January of 2021. It's under advanced contact with LSU, and I hope to squeeze a few articles out of this material and some more talks and course, I'll be here teaching 11th grade US history in the meantime, and probably not getting grades in quite soon enough because of all this, but that's that. So thank you all for your time. Now, how do I stop share? Okay, there we go.
You did it.
Yep.
You did it. Thank you. Thank you, John. That was great. If anybody has a question, would you shoot it to me in the chat so that we can start the conversation? This is also a small enough group to where if you'd like, you can certainly indicate that you're just raising your hand. Dr. Renfro.
Yeah, great job, John. Thank you all. Thank you for sharing that with us. I guess my question is, how is the project going to change from the dissertation to the book, or how are you kind of intending on revising it, I suppose?
More human beings, more actual people. They were always there. It was just a matter of, I guess, having the time to pour over the oral history interviews and dig them out of the newspaper clippings, and hopefully trying to make it more of a human story. And also looking at, and I didn't talk very much about this in the talk, but looking at the destinations that some of them arrived at, some of these out migrants from East Central Mississippi, once they left and went up north, went to the urban Midwest or something like that. And the problems that they faced up there, because as I talked a little bit about this in the dissertation, but as they are being displaced from farms in the South, these ex-farmers are trying their luck in places like Detroit, which of course is factories up there, and in other places in the Midwest are decentralizing, they're automating, they're moving to the suburbs. So there are changes happening at the very same time in the very formerly labor-intensive, factory line type places of employment that most ex-farmers were hoping to land at. So I guess telling a little bit more of a complete story, and then I've culled together a little bit more in the way of sources for Kenya, for South Africa, using FAO and UN and US government stuff, and I guess patching up holes and leaks where they had existed in the dissertation, and where I'd be embarrassed to send out a book manuscript to any reader. I don't know if that answers the.
Dr. Upchurch?
All right, thank you. So John, just really wonderful material and presentation. And I got a little taste of this when I observed one of your lectures last semester. And I just remember like leaving that thinking, oh my God, I am like clearly so behind in US history. This is fascinating material, that's being put out there. I mean, I felt like a fossil when I left the room, because this was such a rich way of thinking about the US South in that context. And I just, hearing like a more sort of expanded version of it that you've just given here today has made me think just all of the different literatures, I mean, that this could potentially speak to or within. I mean, and maybe just some at the end of a long sort of string of things, maybe I'm gonna just get you to react a little bit to it if you can, but you've already touched on some of it, right? One is the idea of mechanization in general, right? Because the standard narrative of that is just kind of like, we built up this massive industrial base at the end of the Second World War. If we just let it all go away, it's going to create another like economic dislocations like after the First World War. We have to figure out how to, sort of push this out there, right? That's kind of like the positive side of the development narrative, right? And I've often heard a lot of this kind of, explained within that framework, right? So on the one hand, you're speaking to and modifying that very well-known paradigm, in a really interesting way with this. Then the other place I was going as you're talking about it is the differences between like British colonial policy versus US federal relationships to its states, right? And thinking about, okay, well, wait a minute, like direct colonial development aid is really only getting going in a big way post World War II and the British Empire anyway. And sort of the differences between, the sort of like nationalist movements, within the British Empire post World War II. All of your case studies, right, are certainly British also, and I'm kind of curious a little bit about that. Thinking about, just the reason for that, the choice. I mean, although it's such a big project already, making it more comparative outside would take it, just make it unwieldy. But there are a lot of interesting parallels. But I'm just wondering if, rather than going on a sort of a laundry list of other things like this, interesting debates, do you sort of get a sense of that you're sort of really kind of breaking into a lot of debates in a really sort of a fresh way, right? And I think you've got a real opportunity to do this, and maybe either comparisons between the US and British policy, or this idea of sort of development mechanization post World War II. Is any of that all sort of resonating with how you're conceiving this as you move through these next few months to get your manuscript ready?
Thank you, Dr. Upchurch. Well, so to address the first point, or maybe the second point, the Anglophone bent of the transnational connections, that's to make it easier on me, to be perfectly honest with you. There were a few case studies right along, Southern and Eastern Africa that were right near one another and could be talked about in conversation. A lot of, World Bank folks that have written on mechanization in Sub-Saharan Africa have grouped those three settler states together when they've talked about these problems. So it's not totally, without precedent to group those together and look at them as kind of a block. But I was seeing, just kind of out of the corner of my eye, I was seeing similar things happening in what few sources I looked at for Algeria. And then there are basically just lists in US government records of where American farm machinery went in Africa. And it's basically, it's all the places with settlers. It's Algeria, Tunisia, to a much lesser degree, Belgian Congo near the very end, as there are settlers coming in there, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, and then of course the three that I talk about here. So there is some room for expanding in other places. And then of course, outside of the continent of Africa, this is happening elsewhere too. Much of the mechanization writing is Southern Asia. So there are too many connections for me in my my small little corner of the globe that I know or think I know anything about to really extend too far out beyond my own capacity there. But yeah, just the Anglophone stuff, that was basically to make it easier on me to make connections and to say, hey, this is a global issue. This is a global trend. How do we talk about Mississippi as a settler society in conversation with what's happening elsewhere? Lots of debates I have written down here. Yeah, that's. I wasn't quite sure when I was writing the book proposals. I wasn't quite sure where to say my intervention was going to be, and I didn't want to say there are tons, because there are not. It's taking bits and pieces of other arguments that people have already made, really, and bringing things together that haven't been talked about. I think that's most of the intervention right there, because I don't think I'm saying anything new, really, unfortunately. But I just sometimes putting old things together next to one another produces a new picture that makes us think in ways we haven't thought about. So I think that's where the intervention is, and that's in the book proposal. I basically said, look, the literature on the Southern enclosure movement, which is what some people call this thing that happens in the South in the 40s and 50s, is kind of hopelessly provincial, and we need to extend things out a bit and widen our gaze and see what's going on elsewhere.
Can I jump in with a question?
Yes.
I And I apologize, I'm really sleep deprived, so if it doesn't make sense. But the last thing you said, I think really sort of strikes me as maybe part of why your intervention is really important, is that I wonder how much the political rhetoric of the day, but also kind of just of the post-war South, and specifically like cotton kind of farming societies, is this argument about how like this is local American agriculture. And so like one of my questions as I was listening to your talk was to hear a little bit more from you, like kind of how your, I think, really important focus on kind of the agricultural side and the land side kind of actually helps us understand these like much broader like political trends that all of us are talking about right now. Because I've sort of been thinking kind of generally too about how it strikes me that one of the things that's really fascinating about Southern politics is the way that it's always about land and it's always about agriculture, even when it's not explicitly that way. And how much, even for somebody like me who grew up like literally surrounded by cotton fields, it's taken me a really long time to realize how much like it's that agriculture that's really shaping the politics, even if nobody's really talking about it in those terms. And so it strikes me that like one thing I would just be curious to hear more from you about is how there is maybe a kind of rhetoric kind of built into especially white settler politics that says like, this is a really local thing. This is our agriculture. Like we don't have to talk about cotton production in India or South Africa because we have this way of understanding ourselves that says like, this is what we do. And so it's at least it strikes me that part of what you're describing actually is maybe part of the political strategy itself. And so I'd be curious to hear your reaction to that.
I was on mute. Thank you for your question, Dr. Wood. What you're talking about, I told one of my friends that I grew up with around here in South Georgia about the project, and we were kind of talking back and forth because his grandparents were, he's a white guy. His grandparents were sharecroppers, and they were able after the war to buy themselves out of sharecropping and get a piece of land, and the county agent helped them out, and they expanded and got everything they needed, and they ended up fine. And so from his perspective, this was a positive development. I mean, this was great. People got more work done with less effort, and that was that. And when I tried to sort of make the global connections and to say, look, the same thing is happening everywhere. It's an agrarian transition issue. I mean, it's very much global. It's what Eric Hobsbawm calls the death of the peasantry. He said, well, and this is a direct quote, he said, that's too global. I like not thinking like that. And so I don't know what that says, but I think there's a need to want to normalize or just sort of gloss over maybe what happened with this upward redistribution of real property in the 40s and 50s. And for a lot of people, just not even mention it. Not in the scholarly community, of course, but in the public narrative. The public narrative of what happened in the 1950s and 60s in the South is totally political, totally focused on civil rights, focused on social movements and grassroots change and everything. And only recently have many people that I've come across outside of the academic world really started to talk very much about land in these terms. Of course, it's in everything that, I mean, I work here in Lee County, and it's still kind of an agricultural county. So people do talk about it, but there's a disconnect between what happened in the 50s and 60s, the post-war politics, the upheaval, the social upheaval, and anything that happened on the land. I don't really know what to attribute that to, other than the way that Americans have, in general, just kind of normalized and routinized settler, appropriation of land and exploitation of it and of its people, and not thought a single thing. I mean, it's I think kind of a uniquely American phenomenon. I mean, I've talked to my friends who live in New Zealand, and they're settlers, but they're very aware that they are, and they're very aware of the history that they live at the other end of. So I don't know, a selective amnesia or something about certain aspects of this problem. And I don't know if I'm getting to what you asked.
Well,
but
I mean, I wonder, and part of this is because I'm hearing your project right after reading Katie Beasley's dissertation on like the like just before the Great Depression and how kind of open people are to kind of federal, maybe not intervention, but like federal people kind of hanging around. And like the period you're talking about, which is after the Depression, is that's kind of been shut off completely. And so I wonder how much this kind of Southern turn away from, national level, whether they be bureaucrats or regulators or whatever, kind of like shuts off this, you don't want anybody from the outside. You don't want anybody from the federal level. You don't want anybody, much less from an international kind of scale, to be kind of in your business. And so I wonder like how much there is like this kind of reflects like a kind of turning inward that might be different from a couple of decades before.
Well, I don't know about the premise there, because they were selectively against outsiders. It seems like, at least in the area I'm looking at, they were very much against outside ideas that in any way threatened white supremacy. But the USDA and its massive bureaucracy, they seemed perfectly fine with having a footprint in every single county in the South. And they ate up the expertise and the credit and everything that they got from, the Farmers Home Association, or Farmers Home Administration, rather, the Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service. I mean, all of these services and agencies are a federal footprint in a county, but they represent the kind of federal intervention that Southerners, even in the 50s and 60s, were perfectly okay with, in part because I think that they were staffed out to locals. I mean, there were.
And maybe that's why, because I mean, that's something that's still really fascinating to me about a lot of these rural areas even today, is what, there are these like massive protests against, so-called federal intervention, but like these are counties that exist, like live and die quite literally on the Farm Bill.
Yeah.
And so that gets coded as what is state intervention versus not, is totally really interesting. And so it came up to me as being really interesting in your project specifically for this kind of moment as compared to what's coming before and after.
Yeah. No, it's the local staffing. And I think like in Thomas County where I live, the county agent is a local woman that is about 24, 25 years old. She's fresh out of college and grad school, and everybody knows her. And so she's able to navigate pretty easily around the county and do her work. And nobody thinks of her as a the finger of the federal government in their lives or anything like that. But that's, technically, I guess, what it is. And so this stuff got sold to people and it disrupted their communities. And then before they knew it, it wasn't just Black and brown people that were being uprooted and displaced. It was, as I started to kind of suggest at the end there, it's everybody. So before anybody knows it, the thing that they welcomed in as sort of a way to simplify and to uphold, in some cases uphold white supremacy, in some cases just make more money, becomes something that really just disrupts the heck out of the American South almost everywhere in the deep Southern states, and that we're still feeling the effects of. I mean, there are still downtowns in every county of every state of the South that are just that they're ghost towns because nobody uses them anymore because of what happened here. So
let me actually, Jan just asked a very, I think, relevant question to this particular moment in the chat, which is, if we see this as sort of a conscious attempt in the South, or at least whether they saw it as the primary goal or sort of a very happy fringe benefit, right, to uproot Black and brown people, and then, as you say, a little bit too late, maybe they discover that they can't control the monster anymore. To her point, in rural California, this is happening to white farmers as well. So, as you sort of reach out globally and you think about sort of an international settler context, could you also, either for purposes here or for later publication or whatever, are there sort of comparable American examples with this with this federal intervention, and what kind of, how does the death of the peasantry, for instance, do you think export to the American West? Sorry, Jan, am I asking your question appropriately?
Yeah, I mean, especially because you see in California, you see names like Nunes, in Porterville, who's, his family's Portuguese, or, Italians came into California, very much seen as not white, which is part of I think the resentment that comes out of that area, who now, who benefited from mechanization as they bought, small farms and expanded them. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, I'm off mute. Thank you, Jan. And it's good to see you again, by the way. I think I saw you at the National Archives about a year or two ago, and that's the last of them. So, but no, yeah, I'd love to reach out to other places in the U.S. and across crop regions and everything, because this, as you can imagine, this all changes when you leave cotton and move to tobacco or rice or wheat or something like that, which mechanized either much earlier or much later. I mean, cotton was grown in Southern California and everything, but they were, to my understanding, they were already on the factory farm model right off the bat. In many places in Southern California, certainly not everywhere, but the labor patterns were different. There was migrant labor instead of live-in tenant labor and everything. So I'd love to get more well-read and in the different American, crop regions, because that would be super interesting. So maybe that'll be the.
Good to see you, and it's very exciting. Thank you so much for this. It's really thrilling.
Thank you for coming.
It's all right. I would just like to jump in with one more observation, maybe. And it would be something to maybe think about when you're doing this, just bringing the perspective from the British example in a little bit, because, these policies, and it's easy to be a little too cynical about it, but I mean, I think there's a real kernel here in Britain, at least. I mean, the idea post-World War II is we're going to try and get empire right this time. Africa is the new India. We're going to be here for 100 years at least. And we're going to try and, we get it. Racism was our problem in India. And if we had just sort of not been as racist, in these policies, we could probably still be there and could have gotten ahead of the resistance. And, the idea is that we're going to make concessions as soon as the demand is made, for further, as a way to try and get ahead of it and not let it sort of develop. So, I mean, I think that some of the colonial development policies, I think you could be attuned to the idea that the intention of the creation of the policy and the metropole is actually could be quite different from how it looks in the colony or in the local region, right? Because, I would suspect that, that white supremacy as a goal is sort of in the hands of the people that are implementing this. It's always a truism of the British Empire that the settlers are more racist than the policy in the central government. And so to maybe think about just not sort of a unified white supremacy sort of a model, but the sort of intentionality of each different level of sort of ideas and implementation, right? And sort of how it might look different depending on the goals of the people in the specific locality that are implementing it. So that might give you a mechanism to think about sameness across all of these examples, but also teasing out the differences, that you might see too, subtle, but still within the framework. And I think that can make for a really, that can be helpful in the analysis if you're kind of looking for both of those. So.
Yeah, and if I go into any more depth on those issues, I want to run this by. I might have to send you some things to make sure I'm not making an utter fool of myself. But my understanding is that, like you said, the British try and go in for a second colonial occupation, essentially, and the settlers with their racism and their demands and everything kind of just muck it up. And there are constant complaints from the Indian population in at least Kenya through Nehru to London that settlers are demanding far too much for such a tiny handful of a population that's in Kenya. And that population is so small and so vulnerable and so ridiculous that it just, I mean, that's why that's the first one to fall, because you know, they're demanding too much for too few people in too large and complicated a place. But thank you for your comments. I really need to shoot some of this to you if you don't mind.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great project and really fruitful to think about it in this way.
Yeah.
I'm super impressed. So I'm happy to help as however I can.
Well, and I think to your point, Chuck, I mean, John, I wonder if that's sort of, I mean, it's not direct, but I think it does map on very neatly to, you know, maybe Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace think they're doing X, you know, Franklin's dead by then, but you know, I mean, they've sort of put in place this new federal model of, you know, the federal government is going to be involved in your farm, and don't worry, we're going to get you a tractor and all that. But in order to apply that on the ground, you have to make John Rankin and Theodore Bilbo happy. Mm-hmm. And that means that the people, in a weird way, because of the way the United States is set up and the way the Democratic Party is set up to respond to white Southerners, the metropole is constantly in negotiation with the settler spokespeople, right? The colony is constantly coming to the metropole. The settlers from the colony are constantly coming to the metropole and saying, okay, but you can, you know, first of all, we're going to exercise some real discretion over what policy we even let you implement. And then after that, we're basically going to decide how the hell we're going to do this on the ground, right? And we don't care what you said. You know, and I wonder, I think that actually maps really neatly, if that's the way you want to sort of think about that, you know, that there is in the United States this unusually powerful settler lobby, which is the White Southern Committee chairman of the United States Senate, mm-hmm. which is about what John Rankin deserves to be called. Nicer thing than he deserves to be called.
Yeah. Which is, it's the same people that are going to lobby in the ones that are still alive in the 60s and 70s are the same ones that are going to be lobbying for relations with Rhodesia and relations with South Africa. And so that there's literally a settler lot, like a Rhodesia lobby in Congress. And it's all these Southern guys that are, you know, anyway, yeah, that's, I need to make that.
And that's super classic, that kind of class consciousness. I mean, to the early modernists, I'm like, this is familiar. So, yeah.
Well, and they are of a class, you know, the John Rankins and the Theodore Bilbos are of a class that allows them to be senators. You know what I mean? And they are not the old aristocracy. They are the settlers who became powerful because of the mechanics of settlerdom. You know what I mean? They are of a particularly modern sort of vein, and that is what gives them power and authority, and so they are just desperate to hang on to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems, is it connected too to the congressmen, for the most part, who are involved in anti-gay movements in Africa now? You know, that there's this the power of, you know this movement. So you know that there's an attempt to retain power through, you know, gender issues rather than, it's not my field at all. So,
I know you've heard on NPR.
Why are they after, you know, African gay people? You know, this is crazy. Yeah, so.
Well, and there every now and then you see Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump or somebody like that weigh in on issues in South Africa that just bring every old settler fear and grievance back right into the front, the headlines of Fox News or whatever, because somehow strangely, like, the same fears just live on long past, you know, any seeming relevance or anything like that. Thank you for bringing that up, Jan. I want to at least look into that.
Always pleased to help you.
Well, and it maps very neatly right onto what, like, Serena Mary and people like that say about how the gender battles of the 70s are actually proxies for the earlier racial battles, because the Ku Klux Klan realizes, oh, you can't say, sorry. It's my family. Anyway, you can't, the Ku Klux Klan realizes you can't say anymore that you're racist, but you can say you believe in the traditional family model.
Yeah.
And so, that becomes this new, and to go back to Katie's dissertation, right? If you mechanize those farms, I was thinking about those women who were the other side of that, right? If you mechanize the farm, then you get the women out of the field and they become the domestic jam makers, and
right. And then they have time to work for Phyllis Schlafly, right? Like later on.
That was the hope of a lot of families, but the records I was finding, at least for this part of Mississippi, which was kind of poor, a lot of them try and mechanize, and they try and get the money together to get new machinery and get loans to get machinery and more land to make the machinery actually pay, because there's a certain amount of acreage that you have to make the machinery pay for itself. And then en route to that somewhere, the finances just fall apart. And instead of being able to stay home, the landowner's wife ends up having to go to the shirt factory in town, which is already, too many people are trying to work there. This is literally, there's a shirt factory and a glove factory in town that all of the wives who can no longer have time to go to the home demonstration service meetings put on by the county extension service have to go to work, and so sometimes it didn't work out, and sometimes people's entire lives got thrown upside down, and I don't know, it's a big mess. But that's the thing about the stuff that was so infuriating. You see people trying to get a leg up by putting other folks down in a way that's very typically 1950s Southern, and then they just end up destroying everything, themselves included. But
they don't question the structure. Then they just feel betrayed.
Right.
Like we were promised that this would work
for me. Yeah.
And now I'm angry. I'm more angry than I was. Right.
Yeah. So the next project will be on the history of ice cream or something like that.
You're going to end up in factories again, though. Just wait.
I told you, baseball. You were the one who said you were doing baseball, and I said, that sounds great. Let's do that.
Minor league baseball. Nothing bad about that.
Knowing you'd get way too involved in the labor relations part of it. It just make you depressed.
I bet that's really, that gets really
dire. It's a bad deal.
Yeah. Well, Kurt Flood,
Oh, there you go. There you go. I'd buy that book. Write that book. Write that book and say you knew us all when. That's good. Well, thanks to everybody for coming. I think this was a fantastic conversation, worthy of a fantastic presentation. And I am so glad that everybody came and really, I think, had John, I hope you found it fruitful. I sure did. I thought it was cool. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I had a great time, and thank you all for first of all for showing up on a Wednesday afternoon, and now it's 5:16, so thank you for staying, and thank you for all your comments and questions.
Yeah, what time is it where you are? It's
6 hours ahead, so I see that.
Gosh, Jen.
You're the only one I would do that for, John.
Thank you. Where are you right now?
Huh?
Where are you right now?
Regensburg, Germany.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
stayed for the pandemic.
Awesome.
Bye, you guys. Good to see everybody.
Yep.
Bye. Everybody be safe. Be safe.
Y'all too.
Soon.